Welcome to English as a Second Language podcast, number 7. Welcome to another edition of English as a Second Language podcast, brought to you by www.eslpod.com. I'm your host, Dr. Jeff McQuillan, Senior Researcher at the Center for Educational Development here in Los Angeles, California. ESL Podcast is especially made for you, those who are trying to improve their English listening and speaking. If this is the first time listening to this podcast, I recommend that you go to our website, www.eslpod.com, to read more about how best to use this podcast to improve your English. ESL podcasts have two parts. The first part is an interview, conversation, or story by a native speaker. We recommend you listen to this several times. The second part is an explanation of some of the vocabulary and expressions used by the native speakers. This second part is optional, but some people find it helps them understand better. Before getting to today's conversation, I wanted to point out for some of our listeners who may be wondering why the podcast isn't always available at the beginning of every day. We put up the podcast on our website, but it takes some time for iTunes and some of the other software to get it. So there's sometimes a delay, but be assured that we will have a podcast up nearly every day, Monday through Friday. Now let's get to today's podcast. Our topic today is food and cooking. Do you like to cook? Why or why not? We asked this question, as usual, to a couple of native speakers. First we're going to hear from Mary, and then I will give my response. And as usual, we will end with some discussion of vocabulary. Let's listen in.
I love to eat, but I don't like to cook. Not at all. I probably don't like to cook because I'm really bad at it. When I was growing up, my mother did all of the cooking in our house. But I never did learn how to cook any dishes at all. And so when I went to college and I moved into my own apartment, I had to learn how to cook a little bit. Usually what I made were very simple instant things, like I made ramen noodles. I bought a lot of TV dinners, and I also bought a lot of frozen pizzas. So I didn't have a very good diet when I was in college. But I ate a lot of things that were easy to make and that were in my very small student budget. Later on, I did try to learn how to cook a little bit. I tried to cook for a boyfriend or two. And each time I tried to cook, I would get some simple recipes that required things like marinating the meat, chopping up the vegetables, getting spices to add to the dish. And I would do all of those things. And I would spend a lot of time, maybe hours and hours, working on cooking a meal. And then in the end, it would always turn out badly. Either I would cook it too long and it would burn, or overcook it, or it would just simply taste terrible. I don't think I'm made out to be a cook.
I like to cook occasionally, every once in a while. I probably cook now about 3, maybe 4 times a week. By cook, though, I mean prepare a very simple dish. Um, Usually it involves either rice or pasta. I like to boil pasta, and then I buy a bottle of pasta sauce with tomatoes and mushrooms and other spices, and I mix the pasta with the pasta sauce, and so I have my own Italian dish. Then I add chicken to that, and so it's like a hot um, pasta salad with chicken. That's my easiest dish. Um, I have a few other dishes that I make. I like to cook fish. I like eating fish, and so I steam the fish and then pour some hot oil over it. But generally speaking, I'm usually pretty busy. I don't have a lot of time to make up a meal. I don't know how to cook from scratch, so I need a recipe to tell me what to do. Um, a lot of my quote unquote cooking usually involves things like opening up a can of soup and putting it into a bowl and then putting it into the microwave oven. So, like a lot of busy people, I don't feel like I have a lot of time to cook, and so I end up either eating instant foods, frozen foods, or going out for dinner. Someday, I hope, I'll have time enough to learn how to cook properly. Let's go over some of the vocabulary and expressions used in these two interviews. In Mary's interview, she started off by saying that she isn't good at cooking. The expression to be good at or to be bad at is what we usually say about how well we can do a certain thing. So, for example, I am good at writing, but I am bad at sports. Another term that was somewhat confusing from Mary's interview and from my interview is the term dishes. Both Mary and I said that we like to cook, and we can usually cook some certain dishes. A dish is part of a meal. So a dish, for example, could be pasta salad. A dish could be ramen noodles. And another dish could be a salad. Typically, in a meal, you have several different dishes. Now, the confusing part is that we also use the term dish to refer to the physical plate and bowl and cup that we use to eat. People will often say, clean up the dishes, or I need to put the dishes on the table. So that word dish has two meanings. It can mean part of the actual meal, the food itself, or it can mean the plates, the saucers, the cups that we use to eat the meal. Mary also mentioned TV dinners. TV dinners are frozen dinners that you can buy that have usually 2 or 3 different dishes in the meal, and you put them either in the oven or in the microwave oven to heat up. We sometimes call these frozen dinners, and they come usually in a little tray, a plastic tray, a holder that is separated for each dish, has its own separate little section. During my discussion, I mentioned that I cannot cook from scratch. To cook from scratch means to be able to cook without having instructions, without having a recipe. I also, in talking about my cooking abilities, said my quote unquote cooking. This expression, quote unquote, is usually used when we don't mean the following words in exactly the way that we would use them otherwise. So if I say, for example, my quote unquote friend has lied to me again or stole my money. Notice that quote-unquote friend means that it's not really our friend. Often we use quote-unquote when we want to indicate that the opposite thing is true. Finally, in mentioning what happens when I get busy and try to cook, I said that I end up eating out, or I end up cooking in the microwave oven, and so forth. To end up means that you try to do something, but for some obstacle or some reason, you're not able to. For example, we wanted to go to a movie, but the tickets were all gone, so we ended up going instead to a cafe. Those are some of the expressions from the interviews today. This is going to complete our English as a Second Language podcast number 7. I want to thank you again for listening and encourage you to email us your suggestions and ideas. Go to our website at www.eslpod.com or send us an email at eslpod@eslpod.com. That's eslpod@eslpod.com. We look forward to seeing you next time on ESL Podcast. English as a Second Language podcast is produced by the Center for Educational Development in Los Angeles, California. This podcast is copyright 2005.